Can agroecology transform global food systems? A report on the plenary sessions of the UN Committee on Food Security, 2025, from a small farmer, by Stephen Leslie. This fall, as things were beginning to wind down a bit on the farm, I was invited to attend a week-long event on food security, taking place at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization headquarters in Rome, Italy. From October 20th to the 24th, the UN Committee on Food Security held its annual hearing of plenary sessions. My role was to attend as a farmer delegate for NFFC and as a representative of affiliates Milford, Vermont and rural Vermont. I was a country mouse heading into the big city, so thankfully for me, I was accompanied by Jordan Treacle, NFFC's Coalition and Policies Program Director, who is a globe-trotting champion for food and farmer justice. This was my first time visiting Rome, so for the two forays I managed to take out into the heart of this eternal city, my jaw was dropping to the sidewalk. But most of the time, we CSF attendees were all locked away in the fascist-era Fellini-esque fortress that is headquarters to the FAO. One consolation prize is that the views of the cityscape from the eighth floor rooftop dining terrace are spectacular. On the weekend prior to the opening of the CFS plenary sessions, Jordan and I attended the annual in-person meeting of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism. NFFC is one of the few U.S. ag advocacy groups present at CSIPM and CFS and has been an active participant for many years. As you can already see, this write-up is treating with a lot of international intergovernmental organizations and their associated acronyms. So to start with, here's a quick primer. The Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, was established in 1945. It comprises 195 member states, including 194 countries and the European Union. The FAO's stated primary goal is to achieve food security for all, ensuring that people have regular access to enough high-quality food to lead active, healthy lives. The Committee on Food Security, CFS, was established in 1974 and reformed in 2009 as the foremost international and intergovernmental platform in the field of food security and nutrition. Currently, the U.S. government provides 20% of the FAO budget. One of the most important outcomes of the reforms at CFS was the establishment in 2010 of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, CSIPM. This organization was created as a direct response to the directive of the CFS to give a preferential voice and space to those most affected by food insecurity and malnutrition, who are at the same time the most important contributors to food security and nutrition worldwide. The CSIPM has a unique role at the FAO. It is one of the few spaces in the UN where NGOs and civil society representatives can have a direct role influencing the development of policy. The organizations participating in the CSIPM have more than 380 million affiliated members. Approximately 50 members from 11 zones around the planet attend the annual in-person meeting. The CSIPM meeting was opened by Dionisio Canohui from Guatemala, who represents the International Indian Treaty Council, IITC. Dionisio helped everyone ground themselves in connection and gratitude to Mother Earth and in solidarity with each other. Themes at CSIPM meeting: support and restore collective tenure of land, promote a restoration of the commons, call out the removal of indigenous and traditional people for the purposes of creating carbon sink conservation exclusion zones. Carbon trading is a form of ecological imperialism or green grabbing that displaces indigenous and traditional peoples through forced evictions. Our focus needs to be on restoration of the carbon cycle, not on finding ways to help polluting industries keep on polluting. Vandana Shiva states that if we transition all agricultural land on planet Earth to agroecological systems, we can restore balance to the carbon cycle and begin reversing the damaging effects of climate heating within 10 years. Call out criminalization of land protectors. A recent report issued by the NGO Global Witness reveals that an environmental activist has been killed every 2 days on average over the past decade. The study shows that more than 1,700 people have died while trying to prevent mining, oil drilling, or logging on their lands. Over the last 10 years, Brazil and Colombia recorded the highest number of assassinations. The researchers state that these figures very likely underestimate the true scale of violence. Many of the activists killed were indigenous people involved in struggles to prevent the exploitation of their lands by international corporate developers. How long can we stand by while our indigenous sisters and brothers shoulder the immense task of standing up to rapacious corporations and their private armies? Toxic ag chemicals poison land and people. The International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, operating under the auspices of the United Nations, has estimated that for every 220 pounds of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer applied to the soil, 2 pounds ends up in the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, a gas that is 300 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas and is the world's most significant ozone-depleting substance. In 2014, this was equivalent to the average annual emissions of 72 million cars driven in the United States, about a third of current U.S. fleet of cars and trucks. With the wholesale use of chemical fertilizers, we have become our own worst enemy by salting our own fields. A major component of chemical fertilizers is soluble salts. Synthetic fertilizers impoverish our soils, depleting them of organic matter and of resilience in the face of flood or drought. In a nutshell, the use of synthetic fertilizers poisons the land and water while it increases farmer debt. Call for reform of trade policy. Bring trade into this discussion. Question why philanthropy is given more and more space at CSF. Point out that innovation does not necessarily mean more technocratic solutions. Agroecology is more than practices. It is a social movement. 800 million people in this world suffer hunger. Only those who feel hunger really know its pain. How much is spent globally on armaments? It would take a fraction of that sum to end hunger. Hunger and famine are political challenges, which is why a human rights approach is critical to finding real and lasting solutions. The CSIPM Youth Contingency presented their youth priorities for 2025, an impressive two-page document with demands that could and should serve as a blueprint for a just transition to an ecological civilization. The consensus at CSIPM this year seemed to be that the organization needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, but that this challenge represents real opportunity. The resolutions of the CFS adopted by participating countries are non-binding. Therefore, CSIPM must find ways to step in to hold governments accountable. The organization's role now is to be a disruptor of a stalled system. Agroecology and climate change. Even a brief summary of all that transpired at the CFS plenary this year is way beyond the scope of my abilities. For the purposes of this report, I think it would be illuminating to focus on two themes that figured prominently in almost every discussion at the two-day pre-meeting of the CSIPM, in the deliberations on the floor of the CFS plenary, and within the content of the side events that took place throughout the week. These two themes are agroecology and climate change. The FAO formally endorsed agroecology in 2015 and issued its 10 Elements of Agroecology framework in 2019. This has been a welcome evolution. Farther back than that, there existed staunch resistance within the institution to small-scale solutions. Since the 1960s, the corporate-driven Green Revolution had a strong hold on academic institutions and global policy makers. Industrial agriculture and the globalized economy were going to bring health and prosperity to the developing world, while filling the coffers of the rich, and everything else was at best a distraction. But the consensus among all the grassroots representatives at CSIPM is that we must be vigilant that the term agroecology does not become just another buzzword like sustainable or regenerative, or that it be compromised with an industry-driven certification program like the organic label. Time and again, the point was raised that agroecology cannot be reduced to a set of practices. It is fundamentally a movement of people. Already, government and corporate interests are asking, how does this scale up? But that is the wrong question. The success of this movement depends on horizontal adoption of the methodologies passing from farmer to farmer and community to community. Many popular organizations of small-scale farmers, peasants, and farm workers from around the world are trying to globalize agroecology. The policy wing of this movement is La Via Campesina, an international alliance of indigenous, traditional peasant, and small farmers. The LVC leadership formally embraced agroecology in 2015. Back in the 1990s, La Via Campesina initiated the food sovereignty movement, the right of peoples to collectively build and control their own food systems, land, water, seeds, and territories based on ecology, culture, and social justice. With over 300 million members worldwide, this organization demonstrates the strength of people power that is facing down the Goliath of globalized industrial food system. Agroecology is the basis for food sovereignty because it encompasses both the on-the-ground methodologies and the social sciences of movement building. There are two origin stories regarding the coining of the term agroecology. One is that the term was created by the American agronomist Basil Benson, who was experimenting with ecological approaches to agriculture back in the 1920s. The other older story is that the movement started more than 5,000 years ago in central Mexico and was rediscovered when university agronomists in the 1970s, working with Mayan farmers, began to understand the profound ecological science of the milpa system and realized it was a truly long-term sustainable approach. The two distinct origin stories mirror what agroecology is defined as today, braiding the best of Western science with the traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people. In this sense, agroecology is the systematization of ancestral, indigenous, peasant, farm worker, and migrant ecological knowledge universally applied to food and farming systems. Some of the Mexican agronomists made their way to UC Santa Cruz in California and founded the first academic institute of agroecology. Meanwhile, the Mayan farmers, who have survived over 500 years of resistance to the colonial settler project, and their allies continue to organize and advocate for their human rights and the rights of the living earth, manifesting clearly that agroecology is about asserting the right to life for all that lives. The CSF plenary sessions. 37 countries were represented at the CSF plenary sessions this year. The sessions were led by outgoing CSF chairperson, Her Excellency Ambassador Nosifo Nauska Jean Jejil of South Africa. Judging from the outpouring of praise she received from ministers and ambassadors from every corner of the globe at the close of the final sessions on Friday, it seems clear that she was a well-respected and highly regarded leader. For this year's plenary sessions, the CFS tasked the body with articulating and passing three main directives concerning peri-urban agriculture and food systems, conflict and its impact on food systems, food resiliency, and global food governance. All three resolutions were passed. The presiding U.S. ambassador regretfully informed the secretary that his government could not support the resolutions as passed because they contained references to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The U.S. has become an obstructionist presence at the CSF. Countries like Colombia and Brazil are leading the way with land reform, environmental protections, recognition of indigenous rights, and promotion of sustainable farming. Peri-urban agriculture. As of 2020, more than half of the human population lives in cities. It is estimated that we may have as many as 10 billion people on the planet by mid-century, and that 80% of them will be urban. Approximately 1 billion people will be displaced by climate change. There was a time in the 19th and early 20th century when most cities in North America and Europe were surrounded by a perimeter of small farms raising fresh produce for local markets. Famously, in Paris, the French intensive method of gardening was developed as a highly efficient and productive peri-urban system based on recycling organic waste and livestock manure. More recently, cities like Detroit, Michigan, and Havana, Cuba, have been leading the way in supporting innovative urban farms. Small farmers who are displaced by war and climate have the skills and traditional knowledge and simply need the backing to transform cities from blighted landscapes and food deserts into diversified agroecological food production centers. CSIPM youth leader Samuel Ikua is based in Nairobi, Kenya, a city of over 5 million people. The city government supports peri-urban agriculture and created a position for a minister of urban agriculture to oversee its development. Samuel works with Habitat International Coalition to teach local people the skills and knowledge they need to start urban farming projects in order to provide income and food security. Urban food security for displaced persons is increased by creating small-scale farming opportunities on open lots within the city that can be either public or private, held by communities, institutions, or churches, or even within road margins and riparian zones. Nairobi has implemented citywide composting of municipal waste, primarily fresh foods from markets. There is a local company that manufactures small-scale biodigesters that can convert food waste to provide gas for household stoves to replace charcoal. Farmers are growing crops and raising small livestock for milk, yogurt, and meat, while recycling nutrients and regreening urban zones. There is no plot too small in the city to not be included in a relocalized urban food system. Conflict and its impacts on food systems. On the first day of the plenary sessions, CSIPM delegates left the plenary floor when a representative from Israel stood to offer their national report on the state of food security. The CSF recognized that prolonged conflict impacts environment, health, food security, access to medicine, education, and energy. We must condemn the use of food as a weapon. We must recognize that war is ecocide. The CSF Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Michael Fakhri of Canada, spoke to the plenary in very forceful terms about the failure of the UN to respond in any meaningful way to the genocide occurring in Gaza. He said that, just as Gaza has been reduced to rubble because of its failure, the UN likewise is in rubble. Now is the time that both Gaza and the Committee on Food Security need to be rebuilt. In Gaza, where once grew 1 million trees, now stand only 1,000. Even before October 7th, 2023, the Israeli army had pushed the line of security deeper into the territory, usurping thousands of acres devoted to food production and uprooting olive groves that had been established there for centuries. The CSIPM staged an intervention from the floor to protest the ongoing genocide and weaponization of food to cause starvation. They voiced a demand for accountability on food security in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, and the conflict in Sudan. Food governance. The main takeaway from the plenary session on the reform of governance to increase global food security. It comes down to defining access to food and land as fundamental human rights. Access to adequate food is a basic human right. Access to land is a basic human right. Access to food is also a basic right of all that lives. When we recognize this right and act on it, we begin to restore biodiversity. The right to food for all beings must be incorporated into solutions to the climate crisis and loss of biodiversity. Agrobiodiverse agriculture and food security should be made top priorities within all climate action targets. In many countries experiencing high levels of insecurity, women are often sole providers to children and are themselves farmers. Therefore, it is most important to ensure that women have access to land. Community cooperatives and farmer-owned credit unions should be promoted as levers for increasing land access for women. A pattern that is often repeated is that men go to cities in search of work and women stay home to farm. If the husband dies while he is away, the title passes to the next male heir, and the woman is left destitute. If we are to succeed, We must let biocentrism serve as an anchor of all actions. We must let human rights serve as an anchor of resilience. Ultimately, biocentrism is inextricable from human rights. They are one and the same. Land governance and land reform must shift toward preservation and restoration. We must place a priority on restoring agrobiodiversity within all agricultural landscapes. Recognition of the rights of nature is also a lever for enhancing food security. The land requires tenants, good stewards, and people who will defend it. Increasingly, there is international momentum to extend the struggle for universal human rights to recognition of the rights of the natural world. This indigenous-led movement seeks to grant recognition and civil rights to all denizens of the non-human world, including entire ecosystems and the natural entities within them, such as rivers, mountains, forests, and the species that inhabit them. It declares that ecosystems have an inherent right to be protected from exploitive resource extraction. Even if one does not embrace a biocentric ethic, systems-based science has shown that it is in humanity's best interest to halt the destruction of ecosystems and to apply nature-based solutions to help stabilize the climate. We find ourselves on the threshold of a new era in which a return to the commons, this time on a planetary scale, is our only sane path forward. In 2008, Ecuador became the first nation-state to enshrine a code granting rights to nature. Since then, many communities, tribes, and nations have followed with varying commitments to enact environmental jurisprudence. In 2024, rights of nature laws have gained passage from local to national levels in 40 countries, including dozens of cities and countries throughout the U.S. These legal codes take the form of constitutional provisions, treaty agreements, statutes, local ordinances, and court decisions. Discussion on the plenary floor concerning the friction between agroecology and value chain food markets. Is there a way to resolve them? Agroecology offers solutions that encompass climate change, loss of biodiversity, desertification, and food security. But is agroecology an effective business model? Well, if you think the business as usual model is sustainable, then the answer is probably not. But if you perceive that the current industrial global food system is in the late stages of collapse, then the answer is that agroecology represents our last best hope to ensure a livable future for the next generation. There are so many hidden costs to our current food system. The FAO estimates an annual 12 trillion in hidden externalized costs accrue to agribusiness. A just transition will require long-term investment in reconfiguring farm infrastructure and investment in community building structures. The imposition of top-down models is doomed to fail. Horizontal farmer-to-farmer communication is a proven strategy. Field agents for government, NGOs, and industry must foster multifunctional food systems that are science-based, people-centric, and context-specific. Discussion on the plenary floor concerning the causes of inflation. Ministers and ambassadors from countries that are under heavy sanctions, such as Belarus, made the point that sanctions contribute to global inflation by increasing the prices on food and energy commodities. Sanctions can also augment the suffering of countries already experiencing food insecurity, as was testified by ministers from Venezuela and Cuba. Based on the experience of disruptions to supply chains during the COVID pandemic and the impact that had on driving higher costs on consumer goods and food, it is clear that increased shocks due to climate instability are already negatively impacting industrial food production. Climate disruptions in supply chains are already driving global inflation of food costs. The endlessly increasing cost of production embedded within fossil fuel-intensive factory farming, cost push, is another key factor causing inflation. Agroecology reduces the cost of production by reducing the need for off-farm inputs and by increasing food self-sufficiency. Flora Sonkin of the Society of International Development delivered an intervention on the plenary floor representing CSIPM in which she denounced corporate concentration of food systems and unprecedented levels of global military spending. She pointed out that just a fraction of the $2.7 trillion spent last year on armaments would be sufficient to relieve all debt and remove insecurity from every country in the world. She closed with a vision for a path forward. The CSF could serve as a space to facilitate policy convergence and discuss how such governance and regulatory reforms can support agroecological food systems transformation. There's no food security and food justice without debt, tax, and climate justice. VGTTs. The voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security is known as the CFS BGGT. Its mission is to promote secure tenure rights and equitable access to land, fisheries, and forests as a means of eradicating hunger and poverty, while supporting sustainable development and enhancing the environment. The strategies of the BGTTs is to create an action plan based on human rights and scientific research. These policy products are produced by the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. The HLPE-FSN is composed of a steering committee of 15 internationally recognized experts in a variety of food security and nutrition-related fields. The primary challenges to the functionality of the VGTT are identified as lack of funding and lack of technical support. Because the recommendations, directives issued by the CSF are non-binding, it means collective will to bring the guidelines to life must happen at a local level. How do CSF products become policies of change that affect farmers, markets, schools at a granular level? Is there any reliable traceability, accountability of impact? Recommendations to make the move from text to transformation include strengthening links between people on the ground and institutions working on food security, and promoting intersectionality between international, national, and local players. Side event on agroecology. Several of the panelists at the side event on agroecology made it clear that it is not a set of formulaic practices that can be imposed from the top down on local communities and have any chance of long-term success. In his closing statements, the ambassador from Senegal counseled that those who offer technical support to become more mindful of the language that they use, and that when introducing new concepts, one must understand the existing wants and needs of the people. He said that in his country, if you ask the average small farmer on the ground what it is they want, they will tell you, I want peace with myself, I want peace with nature, and I want peace with my ancestors. The ambassador said that we must learn to contextually translate the introduction of new methods so that they can be understood within those terms. The ambassador from Ireland said that while his country fully supported the development of agroecology in other countries, he didn't think its principles were applicable to his own country, which is only good at growing grass, and by inference, cattle. If in this instance we take context as our first principle of agroecology and apply it to Ireland, we see that there was a time centuries ago when 80% of the island was covered by a temperate rainforest. What better way to restore biodiversity and build in climate resilience and food security than to begin a large-scale program of reintroducing and reintegrating native trees into Ireland's agricultural landscapes? Tiali Terena, a CSIPM Indigenous youth leader and representative for the IITC from Brazil, spoke plainly about the complete incongruity of trying to pair the agroecological movement to the free market capitalist system. She pointed out that capitalism has propelled humanity into global overshoot and provides no realistic solutions for restoring balance. She advocated for relocalized and sovereign food systems as our best hope for feeding the world and repairing the planet. She called for recognizing and uplifting the indigenous and traditional peasant farmers who are leading the way. Taili stated that in this pivotal moment, it was imperative for all of humanity to adopt and integrate indigenous worldview in which relationality and reciprocity with the living earth are guiding principles for all our actions. Tilly stated that we are past the time when we can settle for reforms of our food system, that we must undertake transformation. Begins by learning to respect planetary boundaries. According to the United Nations Council on Biodiversity, 80% of the biodiversity remaining on Earth is on lands under the caretakership of indigenous people who make up about 5% of the human population. Precious Firi of Zimbabwe, who is a small farmer with CSIPM and is a core member in several organizations, including Regeneration International, advocated for uplifting women farmers as the best way to ensure food security and environmental protection in local communities. She made a passionate plea for seed sovereignty, stating that we must not forget that culture only exists because of agriculture. Seeds retain the memory of the land. Seeds contain language, practice, and identity. For my people, our land is life. The protection of seeds is a matter of territorial justice. Side event on neglected and underutilized species. Noose. Rice, wheat, and maize account for 40% of global calorie consumption. Seeds are provided controlled by five major companies. 75% of seed varieties have disappeared. Worldwide agrobiodiversity has been reduced from 7,000 plant foods to 170 varieties. One in five people on the African continent are food insecure. Globally, 1 out of 10 people suffer obesity. This number has doubled in 10 years. In the US, adults get 65% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. Chronic illnesses are becoming more prevalent than infectious disease. Around the world, 4 trillion is spent annually on medical costs. 25 to 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the current industrialized global food system. The planet has seen a staggering loss of 70% of its biodiversity since the 1970s. The FAO estimates that 70% of the world's food supply is still produced by small farmers, 25 hectares or less. Good farming requires long-term vision. The capitalist system requires short-term thinking with the quickest possible return on investment and with a focus on maximum yields. We need to measure nutrition not just in calories produced per acre. NUS foods generally have much higher nutritional values in comparison to common domesticated crops. They are the elders of the community of domesticated crops. They often exhibit extraordinary genetic plasticity. They are climate resilient and pest resilient. They enhance agrobiodiversity below and above soil. India successfully reintroduced millet, a highly nutritious pseudograin, as a remedy to the complete takeover of hybridized rice and wheat resulting from the Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. Chia leaves and seeds are emerging as a success story in Guatemala. Neglected and underutilized species have often been traditionally grown as components within agroecological systems. Agroecology focuses on maintaining territorial and circular food markets. It seeks to uplift traditional social and cultural food systems. It resists the corporate food takeover by practicing food democracy. It replaces external inputs and farmer knowledge and supports farmer-to-farmer innovation. It protects farmer-based seed-saving systems. There is growing momentum for the recovery of neglected and underutilized species within traditional agroecological systems. The downside of the development of NUS is that when they are successfully upscaled to corporate value chains and marketed as superfoods, as happened with quinoa in the Andes region, the small landholders are squeezed out by the ramp-up of production, and the food itself becomes too expensive for them to buy. Technical assistance providers should focus on the goals of self-sufficiency and improved nutrition. Sales of surplus crops can then be sold to emerging markets. The strategy here is that if corporate buyers find sustainably sourced suppliers available cheaper elsewhere, farmers will still be able to feed themselves. Side event on living income. This event focused on ways to leverage the current food system to adopt a living income rubric for producers. Building on the concept of a living wage, the living income is a systems-based approach that uses holistic data collection to indicate a standard of living income in any given region and maintains that this ought to become the benchmark for both government and the food industry to hold up against actual income. The gap between the two is the roadmap for action. The proponents work with evidence-based goals to engage technical service providers, NGOs, and the food industry, aiming to create a multi-stakeholder front dedicated to achieving an actual living wage for all farmers. Like all aspects of agriculture, living income is inextricably bound with achieving climate goals. If we protect the people who farm from the ravages of poverty, we are also protecting the planet. For instance, food insecurity is a principal driver of deforestation. Only prosperous farmers can invest in their farms. Farmers living in poverty lack the resources to withstand the increasing fluctuations in weather associated with climate change. Providing a living income can help farmers diversify their income streams and stay on their land even during times of high climate stress, such as the protracted drought in East Africa. Living income for farmers is also centered in human rights. Child labor, precarious gender nutrition safety, negative environmental impacts are all symptoms of the lack of sufficient farm income. Regions that are dependent on the export of cash crops are incentivized to produce monocrops. This is evident in the Mexican state of Michoacán, where increased demand for avocado export has driven farmers to level their former mixed crop milpa systems and engage in deforestation in order to plant more rows of water-thirsty monocropped orchards. Achieving food security through increased self-sufficiency is a key element of a living wage. Agrobiodiverse systems can produce surplus cash crops while restoring biodiversity and enhancing local food security. Industry involvement must be monitored for greenwashing. For instance, Nestle, who deals with 5 million farms, has committed to source 50% of regenerative ingredients by 2050. But for corporations the likes of Nestle and Kellogg, regenerative has come to signify industrial-scale, climate-smart farming, such as conventional fossil fuel and glyphosate-intensive no-till grain production. And we might point out that 50% regenerative by 2050 might sound good in a slick ad campaign, but given the dire consequences of irreversible, abrupt climate change, if that is the best we can do, our goose is cooked. In 2014, the FAO estimated that at current rates of global soil degradation, we had less than 60 harvests left. Living income for farmers who adopt agroecological methods is a social justice issue. It is also the wisest investment societies can make to salvage a living planet for our children from out of the wreckage of the collapsing industrial food system. If you transform the food system, you transform everything, for better or worse. Whether they are from the global north or south, small farmers all over the world face similar challenges as they struggle to survive in the unregulated global capitalist system that seeks to turn everything into a commodity. Globally, all farmers are only paid about 5% of every food dollar spent. Our best hope for survival in the 21st century lies in understanding the fundamental role soil health plays in supporting all of life. This is why land caretakers who are capable of growing healthy soils as they produce food, medicine, fuel, fiber, and building materials must be rewarded with a living wage and benefits by society at large. Collectively, we need new agreements that recognize soil as the fundamental infrastructure and the essence of the commons. The wanton destruction of soil ecosystems can no longer be a right of private property owners or corporations. The principal way to achieve national soil health is to guarantee a universal base income to farmers, defined by the USDA and IRS as those who earn at least 50% of their household income from a land-based enterprise. We need to guarantee a universal base income to farmers who have or are willing to transition their operations to agroecological soil health management systems. To ensure a living income for farmers and farm workers, we can utilize mechanisms already in place. Payments to farmers could be a combination of direct payments for adoption of practices and ecosystem services, along with more traditional safety net programs to create equity in the market, such as price parity for local farm products, regional supply management of milk and other commodities, and whole farm revenue insurance. Additionally, farmers could receive assistance through social programs such as free health care and dental insurance, paid parental leave, child care, and affordable housing subsidies. We need to move from transactional strategy to transformational policy now. Over the last 25 years at our small diversified dairy farm in Vermont, we have been integrating elements of agroecology and agroforestry into every aspect of the farm language with intensive management grazing, micro-wetland protection, pond installation, riparian buffer, silvopasture, pollinator hedgerow, coppiced windbreak, no-till vegetable production, and alley cropping. We have seen steady improvements in soil health and yields through stacking multiple soil health practices. Our model isn't perfect, it is a work in progress. But we are increasingly aware that the main task of the farmer or any land caretaker ought to be the restoration of the carbon cycle in our soils and all the resulting beneficial landscape functions that are associated with the practices that lead to soil health. The abundant, nutrient-dense food products that result are a happy byproduct of building healthy soil and restoring biodiversity. We are trying to implement practices on the foundational principle that the best adaptation is mitigation. One of the best things about attending the CSIPM CSF sessions was all the networking that happens in between meetings. I made meaningful connections with farmers and small farmer advocates from every region of the globe, including fellow Vermonters from the UVM Institute for Agroecology. I met a French sociologist studying the soil health and psychological benefits of working with draft horses, an Irish farmer who heads an NGO supplying nutrition to new mothers on the African continent and who has planted 3,000 native species trees on his family farm, and a La Via Campesina representative from Pakistan who is fighting for rights of small landholders while also struggling to hold on to her own family's farm. After attending the CSIPM meeting in Rome, I feel reinforced and reinvigorated with the awareness that we are part of a regional, national, and international grassroots agroecological movement mobilizing to create resilient, relocalized, and sovereign food systems within every bioregion of our sacred Mother Earth. We protect what we love. The end.